but we'll go and get started. Preston Stewart joined today by Chad Scott. Chad, thanks for taking the time to do this, man. It should be fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to it. Definitely. I respect your videos and your opinion hugely. And I've been a subscriber for months with you and love what you do. So
it's awesome. So it means a lot.
Yeah.
So I picked up on your content probably towards the start of the war in Ukraine. And you definitely, and we were talking about this a little bit before we went live, but you're able to kind of dabble into other areas that I'm not as comfortable with, be it China, the economic impact in Russia, NATO in general. I think you've got a lot more experience with NATO than I do. But what, as we sit here, October 11th, 2022, what's kind of the thing you're paying the most attention to when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I'm paying the most attention to the Kremlin. What has become abundantly clear is this idea that Vladimir Putin is this military genius, this wartime leader, has completely collapsed. And it collapsed before our eyes in the West, before our eyes in the United States, much earlier than it's starting to collapse in Russia. And they're starting to see it. And you're seeing people in the inner circle in the Kremlin start to form cracks in the wall of support that used to be this unquestioning support for Putin. Is starting to crack, and you're seeing some of his own internal people start to question that openly. You start to see the very heavily propaganda-driven media coming out of Russia now starting to question: is this war effort really going the way we think it is? The fact that they've even transitioned from calling it a special military operation to a war is something that is significant. And now we are looking at a Vladimir Putin that I think is in a position where he is at his weakest. And this is why we see things like objective terrorist attacks. It's what yesterday when we saw the rocket attacks into like 20 cities, they shot dozens of rockets at no military targets. It's two things are happening. One, he doesn't have the capability to precision strike military targets. So he is firing into large cities to elicit terror. And he's doing this to signal to his own people, his own war hawk section of his party. We say party as if there's an opposition that is valid there for him. And he's signaling to them that he is still strong, that he is still in charge, that he is still making decisions, and they can still win the war. In my opinion, the reality is they cannot win the war without doing something so catastrophic and so stupid that inevitably they would still lose. And his support base and his 20 years of building up where he was, were bringing him to the forefront of this Russian return to power, is now completely crumbled. And the Russian people are starting to recognize that they're being set back 30, 40 years at this point. And they're going to start rising up a little bit more than what we've seen and pushing back on Putin. So
there's been anytime something comes out of Russian media, there's always an argument that's planned, kind of this idea that Putin is this grandmaster. So even when opposition comes out, the opposition was planned so that he could take a certain type of action. Has that ever been the case? Or is this drastically different than that, to where like this is too far to where it would benefit him, kind of thing?
In the initial stages, absolutely. He would play both sides. He would play the Ukrainian bad side. He would show, like when we saw attacks in Belgorod in Russia, and they were unexplained earlier in the war. Because you have to remember, earlier in the war, Ukraine was building Molotov cocktails. That was the military they had. They didn't have all of this Western support. But in the initial stages, weird attacks were happening in Russia, and he was blaming Ukraine. Those are likely false flags. Where he was running, he was creating, he was puppeteering everything. And that was where we were all thinking, well, he is kind of a military genius in this space. It wouldn't work against the West, obviously, like NATO countries, but now it's reactionary. This latest attack was a reactionary response to Kerch Bridge. He called that a terrorist attack because he didn't want to admit that it was Ukrainian planned, because that shows weakness within, that he can't control. He can't secure the bridge that he himself drove across in 2018 proudly driving the truck. I don't know if anyone ever remembers that video of him driving the truck across the Kerch Bridge. That bridge is now destroyed. It's being rebuilt and it'll open up again. But it was a symbolic hit to him personally. That was something that was a personal goal. So he reacted not in a overtly planned way. He had the targets pre-planned likely, but he said, do it. I need to show strength. I need to show that I'm still in control. This was a terrorist attack, not a military attack on the Kerch Bridge. And so he has transitioned probably in the recent months to a probably more than like the last 3-4 weeks since the big offensive push, to a reactionary stance, both within his own country and on the world stage, especially with the escalation of nuclear saber rattling and such.
So I think we're on the same page then. The theories that Putin orchestrated the attack on the bridge in order to escalate, we're saying no, that was Ukrainian. I agree.
I believe Ukraine didn't have the capability to strike them in a military capacity because they don't have the ATACMS long-range missiles yet. I'm hoping I'm of the crowd that believes we should give those to them, but they don't have them yet. So they have no capability to strike with the military capacity, whether it's, Excalibur rounds don't reach that far from you, and that's an artillery round for those of you who don't know that. Those don't reach that far from Ukrainian territory. HIMARS don't reach that far from Ukrainian territory. So they had to do it unconventionally, which was, I fully believe it was a truck bomb. A lot of people said it was a boat, but I've seen images of the underside of the bridge. Doesn't look like there's as much damage. And you can see kind of the blackened circle on the road. And they timed it perfectly to where the train cars were passing at the same time. They were trying to blow up the train bridge using the fuel on the train cars. Unfortunately, they weren't successful. That rail bridge will likely be repaired within the next week. But I believe Ukraine fully is, whether they take it responsibility officially or not, they were behind it.
That's one of those where if you're going to stage a false flag attack, there's other ways to do it that don't actually involve damaging a bridge. You can find explosives under the bridge, right? You can happen to pull over that truck. There's a lot of different things you could do to escalate in that sense without actually damaging. It's important infrastructure, even if it is back up and running to a degree or fully. That's a really risky move, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And the only reason it could potentially benefit Putin to do it himself is a lot of people are fleeing Crimea, and Russia. There's something somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Russians that live in Crimea, ethnic Russians. He was probably sick and tired of people fleeing Russia or Crimea because he needs those people to fight his war. That would be the only reason I could conceivably think that he would want to damage that bridge, is to stop the fleeing of Russians from Crimea back into Russian territory. But again, that doesn't make sense. You can just set up roadblocks and police checkpoints to do that kind of thing. This is an absolute embarrassment for Putin to have that bridge go down. So there's no way he would have done that himself under a false flag.
Well, we've kind of noticed that anything that happens, there's always 100 theories. So it does, I think we're on the same page, or I think we're all getting the same information now of Ukrainian attack, some sort of special operations type deal, truck bomb. But talking about people leaving Crimea, what are you seeing right now? Just hot take on the conscription effort. What's that looking like?
It's a mess. It's a mess. Yeah. The reality is you can conscripting between 300,000 and 1.2 million, depending on where you see the sources coming in. The reality is, and I'm a logistics officer, they don't have the logistics capability to supply those people. They don't have the training capability to train those people. In the early stages of the war, when they started faltering, they pulled their trainers, what would be like their drill sergeants, their what we called OCTs, observer coach trainers. They pulled them from their duties to go to the front lines to fight. So even if they do get these conscripts in, they don't have an NCO corps, which is like the backbone. And we've always said that in the military, they're the backbone. They don't have that available to train these conscripts. So what's happening is, and we've all read this, they're not getting trained. they're getting handed old equipment because their supply chain is corrupt, is ineffective, and because Russians don't move things by road like we do, it's all rail, they have trouble transporting them to where they need to go to get to units. So the control, the discipline, all of that starts to erode when you lose confidence in the leadership. And that's what's happening in these conscription efforts is the guy who was working for LADA or was just a school teacher is now going to his muster site, or where he's going to have meet up with his unit. He is now tweeting back or texting back saying, hey, this is terrible. We're not getting food. We're not getting winter gear. And it starts to sow doubt. And because of that, even if they do say 1 million people show up, go to the Ukrainian border, they can't supply them. It turns into World War II all over again, where it's pick up the rifle of the guy in front of you, and you can't fight a 21st century war like that, period. Not against the military.
I'm in the Army Reserve now and was up at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin a few months ago over the summer. Kind of an obscure little base that it's designed to kind of mobilize units is kind of the idea. And there's a bunch of old World War II looking stuff. I think some of them are from World War II, but you can see the rail line running through there. And like, there's a whole system in place to where if we needed to mobilize, how many people, your job is to go to the railhead. Your job is handing out equipment here. Your job is, and it's this entire crazy organization that comes together just to mobilize a unit out of Fort McCoy to wherever they might be going. I think that's overlooked a lot in this Russian mobilization is just the effort behind, ignore the training piece, even just getting everybody together, equipping them and moving them off. Like that's a sizable effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because even at the smaller bases, so we have a National Guard base here in Boise, Idaho, and if a mobilization were to take place, we have contracts written already in place. All they need to do is hit the go button for things like Home Depot to provide blocking and bracing materials to containers. So like all the wood that you need to put in containers to ship all of our equipment. We have contracts with local grocery stores to provide catered services so that we're not having to feed our guys. We're getting them sped up, trained. Our cooks don't necessarily have to worry about the food portion because their equipment can go overseas. And what happens is the local large restaurants or local stores provide food services. And these are all contracts that we preload, and they're just agreed upon every year. We re-up them. And that is in case of a large mobilization for ostensibly what would be World War III. We can just press play on those and they come to the base, soldiers do their soldier things, and the civilian infrastructure stands up. And a lot of people in the United States don't realize that a lot of the reason why the US is so powerful isn't because we have F-22s and we have amazing tanks, which we do, and F-22s are cool. It's our logistics effort. The fact that we can forward deploy logistics and we can sustain a military anywhere in the world. And before this war in Ukraine started, actually the video that blew up for me, that got me started on TikTok, I said, the Russians can't fight 3 days outside of their border, period. And I was wrong. They can't fight 1 day out of their border because their logistics is so bad. And we, as Americans, have systems in place where we bring in not only our own civilian infrastructure, but we work with German infrastructure to do the same thing. All of our NATO partners, we have had these thought processes of what if, and we can pull the trigger on those, so to speak, to say, hey, we're going to war with Russia, and our entire logistics and mechanized monster of an economy can get behind that. And Russia doesn't have it. It's so disjointed. They don't even agree with each other on what needs to happen. Companies don't want to fund the war effort in Russia. So big difference there in the warfighting capability.
Switch it up to the other side there. What are you seeing in terms of Ukraine's numbers? I want to say the last I heard was around 600,000 mobilized. Is that ballpark? What if you had to rattle it off the top of your head, is that at least in the general area?
I've heard it's 600,000 mobilized and trained, but not entirely deployed. They have like a National Guard force so they also have another 400,000. I believe Zelensky's total wish is the million men, and that's what it was talked about in early stages. And so unfortunately, Ukraine falls into that same realm of Russia, as they don't have the training infrastructure yet. They're trying to get it, but other countries have stepped up. Like, I want to say the United Kingdom is training something like 10,000 every 2 months, and then they're redeploying to Ukraine. But I think there's a million total, but only 400,000 are complete ready to fight on the front line. 200,000 are in the final stages of completed training, equipping, getting dispersed to units, and then there's another 400,000 that is, they're still in training, they're still mustering, things like that. So over the longer this goes, the more the battlefield favors Ukraine heavily, because they are being supported by the West. They're being supported by our training models. And I worked at Joint Multinational Readiness Center in Germany, and we trained Ukrainians. So, and we've been training them since the original 2014 Crimea. So they know it's just getting that juggernaut kind of moving has been difficult for Ukraine. And eventually they'll catch up. But I think you're right. I think roughly it's in the probably 300,000 to 400,000 frontline ready to go, an additional 200,000 that are about there, and then 400,000 are supposed to be coming online probably in early 2023 or later. So that's kind of what it's looking like, but it's not the same type of fight for Ukraine. They're defensive. So if anyone saw, there's reports that Russia's sending troops to Belarus again. That's not something Ukraine can ignore. So they have to spread their troops along that whole front from Kyiv all the way down to Odessa. So they're very good at being mobile and agile across the battlefield, but it's difficult for them because they don't have 3 million people in their total force like some countries do. But because of that, this growing force that they're having, I think that, like I said, the tides are turning in Ukraine's favor heavily. So
given those numbers, I'll go back to something from the start of the war, or I don't know, it could be a couple months in, but a theme that constantly pops up is, so Russia threw between 150 and 300,000 on or about Ukraine. Yeah. I know that number's been debated. Pick the high side there. Say it was 300, which I think is probably more. Like, what? How? Why? How is it still not figured out that they don't have the manpower advantage on the lines and haven't tried to rectify that? Like, what's the disconnect there, do you think? There's actually kind of an interesting, you can just go to the internet and you can see a Russian soldier versus a Ukrainian soldier. And from when I see Ukrainian soldiers, they look like they're a professional military. They look like they're equipped. They have body armor. They have advanced night vision that we've given them. They have all of this equipment, and a lot of them, at least their officer corps and their NCO corps, have been trained in Western training centers or gone to Western training, like war colleges and things like that. Russia doesn't have that. You may have all these people, but I would say that I think a Ukrainian soldier is 5 times more effective than a Russian soldier. So you would, for one Ukrainian soldier to go down, wounded, dead, 5 soldiers on the Russian side will go down because they're just so badly trained and equipped. And you see them, I've seen Russian soldiers going into a battle with tennis shoes on. And I think that Russia thought they were the United States and they could shock and awe into Kyiv, and that wasn't the case. And now they were hugely unprepared to fight a long-term war, as actually Russia always has been. They've never been able to fight long-term wars and win. I mean, even against Afghanistan, they couldn't fight a long-term war and take ground. And a lot of people will say neither could the US. I disagree. We kind of steamrolled them. We couldn't conduct nation building in Afghanistan. That was where we struggled. But yeah, I think it's just the effectiveness of the Ukrainian soldier is so far more advanced than the Russian soldier that those numbers at the very least are equalized on the battlefield. And you see that where
tens of thousands of pieces of Russian equipment have gone down, and we haven't lost a single HIMARS. We haven't lost a single advanced weapon system that we've given them lately. So credit to the Ukrainians and their training and their ability to plan, for sure.
So something that's caught my attention is the flexibility and adaptability. It does seem like it's easy to overlook, and you see these lists of equipment going into Ukraine and you think of it as just a howitzer. Like, those all are different to operate. They're not, they don't always have that much in common. And the targeting systems and the different types of anti-tank weapons, all of that stuff takes so much time to learn how to use efficiently, effectively. And these guys are getting, I mean, I can't imagine what a battalion strength organization looks like in Ukraine right now. It's got to have 70 different types of vehicles.
Yeah.
They're adapting to that, but it doesn't seem like, big picture, Russia has adapted anywhere near as quickly on the battlefield. Now, they have adapted. They are no longer sending single tank columns deep, right? I don't want to take that away as a blanket statement, but it seems like that's been pretty heavily one-sided, the adapting on the battlefield.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I see these, I have people that I talk to, I still have friends at JMRC who are helping kind of shape this effort. And a new phenomenon has come out in this world that's never been seen before. And that is, like, an M777, which is an artillery piece from the US arsenal, will go to Ukraine. Something breaks on it. They may not be trained on it, but what they do have is a point of contact in the US, and they're video calling the US, and US soldiers and mechanics are walking them through on video, showing them how to repair this specific situation. I've seen that. It's pretty impressive. And a lot of it comes from these relationships that were formed in Joint Multinational Readiness Center, et cetera. And so what's happening is they may not have the ability, but they're finding the ability to do it, to repair the things, to work with their Western partners to get what is needed. So, sorry, my dog keeps whining. I think someone's
good. Looking for attention.
But yeah, so I think you're right. I think the adaptability, I think what happens is the distributed leadership. That's a big portion. The United States uses that. We try to distribute leadership to the lowest level. Like, and we always have the saying, in the absence of orders, attack. I think Russia works on the opposite. They wait for orders. They wait for their NCOs, what limited NCOs they have. They wait for their officers to give specific guidance. And if a battlefield chaos falls outside of that guidance, they just shut down and they don't know what to do. They kind of turn into fighting for their life. And because of that, it's chaotic for them and they can't adapt. Whereas the Ukrainians are now distributing that capability to think to the individual soldiers. So teams are moving on the battlefield. Battalions are reinforcing outside of potential scope because they are the guy on ground and can see it. So that's why I see the Ukrainians being so successful, is because they're using more advanced tactics and strategy than the Russians. And the Russians are digging their heels in on what has always been Russian. Throw a bunch of people at the problem and hope it works out. So
you've got some people interested in your dog in the chat.
Yeah.
As you're working on that, go ahead. I was going to say we'll open it up to some questions here in the next couple of minutes and try to get to as many as you can. The next thing I wanted to run by Chad, I'll throw my opinion out there first while he's got his priorities in line there. NATO being involved, the possibility of NATO becoming involved in Ukraine. I'll throw my personal opinion out there and then very interested in yours. I have a hard time understanding what it would take for NATO to actually put boots on the ground. And I think it's beyond a nuclear attack. As in, I think a nuclear attack in Ukraine doesn't necessarily prompt NATO to start a world war. I think there's a lot of other things countries would do. But for the constant question of when is NATO going to be there? When is NATO going to do something? I'm not sure there is a line that can be crossed. Personal opinion, though.
I think there is a line, but it's not as what a lot of people think. Everyone thinks that NATO will get involved if nuclear weapons get involved. And I don't necessarily think that is the case, because the reality is I just don't think nuclear weapons make sense for even Putin. But there is a line. I think the line involves some sort of kind of tertiary effect that Russia has on a NATO country. So obviously there's NATO countries that border Ukraine, Romania, for instance. Like, Russia's been very careful to avoid upsetting Romania. And I think that is on purpose, obviously. He doesn't want NATO involvement. And I don't think, like you said, I don't think a single nuclear attack, it would have to be like a massive strike with multiple nuclear weapons. And even then, it would be a limited NATO. We will never, I don't think ever in this war will we see Abrams tanks rolling into Moscow. I don't think that's a thing.
That's a bit of an escalation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, and we have the capability. Absolutely. The United States and NATO could absolutely steamroll Russia without a question in my mind. However, I think that, and I've said this before on some of my videos, the response to a nuclear attack would be more pain on Russia than escalation militarily, because the Ukrainians are doing such a formidable job at defeating Russia that right now it would open up the checkbook essentially. Tanks would go into, they'd probably start getting Abrams, attack them. At the very most, when it comes to a Russian or a nuclear strike from Russia, we may attack the point of origin for that nuclear weapon, and which I assessed likely would come out of the Black Sea from one of their missile subs, because they don't want to risk an attack into Russia, because then that's war. And Russia, despite what people think and what everyone says, Russia does not want war with the West. Putin right now is doing what I call escalating to de-escalate. He's getting to a point where he knows internally he'll never admit it. He knows he can't win, but he's going to try to escalate to force a back off from Europe, from the United States. And you see that with these missile attacks hitting the power generation sources within Ukraine. And Ukraine had to cut off power to Europe. He's trying to divorce Ukraine from Europe and then try to pull Germany away from Europe as well. It's not working. Everyone's galvanizing around that. And because of that, I think we have a lot of outlets to cause a significant amount of pain to Russia without a NATO attack into Russia, or even NATO ejecting Ukraine. Although it certainly would be justified if radiation moved into Romania or something like that. And that would be the only case I could see it, Romania justifying an Article 5, like start Article, or pushing the Article 5 button on a radiation push from a nuclear strike into Romania. But I guarantee you Putin's going to be very careful about that.
Can you give an example of escalate to de-escalate? It doesn't have to be in this war, and I don't mean that as a prediction of what's to come, but just an example of that. I'm not tracking it entirely. That's why.
So another example would be what China does with Taiwan. China, or actually a better example, and it's not as well known, is North Korea uses escalate to de-escalate all the time. What happens is a lot of people don't understand that we give them. I'm sorry, I got to put this.
How many dogs are in there, man?
He's a cattle dog. He freaks out. Someone's out front doing something, so I have to get him out. I keep him in here to keep him calm. But anyways,
that didn't work.
So, no, it wasn't working. So North Korea goes through a cycle. What happens is they go through a cycle of relative quiet and capitulation to the West's wants. We're not doing nuclear stuff. We're being good. Can we have more food? Can we have more fuel? Can you reduce sanctions? And of course, the West is like, yeah, you're being good people in your government here. Well, they still want to be powerful. So what will happen is they'll start to conduct nuclear tests again. Once they get enough food to feed their population, they'll start being crappy again. They'll start conducting nuclear tests, and they'll escalate until finally they reach the point where the US, and we're at that point right now where these missiles are being fired over Japan and stuff, and South Korea, where they will escalate until they reach a new high of escalation, and then they go, okay, we're being good again. and please give us food. But they never really go back down to where they were. So they're escalating, and then they escalate, and then, but it's always a new norm. And that's what Russia has done recently, is he escalated to he escalates and then gets to a point in Georgia, for instance, where the West was like, all right, enough. And he's like, okay, we're good. And so he's escalated to a point where he can de-escalate, but still maintain control. And that's right now where you can see in Ukraine, the crack starting to form in our resolve, where you see people like Elon Musk come out and say, well, peace is the greater option. So he's escalated to a point, scared enough people that maybe people of influence and power will say, well, maybe we just give them some of what they want so that we don't have nuclear war. Well, inevitably what happens with Putin or Xi Jinping or any of the regimes in North Korea or Iran often is they will de-escalate to a new normal, but it was never back to the original norm. And then a few years later, they escalate again and they have a new peak, and they just slowly chip away at the West resolve. Because like Crimea, for instance, we basically let Russia have it, and he de-escalated before we really got upset. And then, so now he's on the escalation, and now he's hoping that sometime this winter, when it's painful enough for Europe or the US stops caring as much, he can say, okay, we're de-escalating, but then that's the new world we're in. He owns the Donbass. Putin owns Donbass. He owns all of his territories taken. So he's on that part right now where he's trying to be as bombastic as possible in his escalations to say, hey, if you guys all back off, we'll be good. No nuclear war, everything will be fine. But quietly, we'll still own the Donbass and we'll still own the Crimea. But the reality is in 5-8 years, we'll be doing this again with Putin, because he's done it in Moldova, he's done it in Georgia, he's done it, and now he's doing it in Ukraine twice. So that's what that kind of means.
It wasn't very optimistic.
Yeah, no, sorry.
What is the optimistic look for this to end? Like I agree what Musk put out there was personal opinion. I think he put a very nuanced subject in front of a large audience that maybe had not even seen some of those words before. And it's, how many people tried to settle, peace in the Middle East in a tweet? Like, it's not going to happen. Exactly. It's an impossible task. But I do enjoy, I like that somebody is talking about peace as opposed to escalation, which I think tends to rule the airwaves, if I'm being honest, is escalation. I was trying to put together like a snarky comment or something for Elon, like, here's my poll for Elon's thing, but I couldn't come up with anything at all. Where do you think it goes? Where does peace come from in this situation?
Unfortunately, Putin has gotten himself too far into this to and Biden talked about this, to off-ramp. He has got to, the two scenarios that we are on the table right now, because Zelensky has absolutely said he's not giving up territory, and Putin has no way of backing off without being politically fatal to him, whether it's legitimately fatal within his own party offing him, or just politically fatal where he is removed. The two options are, unfortunately, some kind of capitulation by Ukraine saying, yes, we now recognize Russia owns Donetsk, Luhansk. We give them Crimea, which I don't think is going to happen. Ukraine is taking territory in just huge chunks right now, so they see no reason for that. And the other piece is Russia gets ejected, and there is a negotiated peace between probably a Putinless Kremlin, where the pain has been applied economically. People can't get new phones anymore. They're tired of eating at whatever it's called, like Tasty Burger or whatever, instead of McDonald's. They get tired of that lifestyle of not being integrated in the West. And you see this in St. Petersburg. The cracks are heavily forming there because they're Europeanized, and now they're cut off from the European way of life, that cushy European way of life. And I think the only way we see a true peace that is long-term is a peace where Ukraine has ejected Russia and the Kremlin is no longer under Putin control. And that means a lot of his staff as well. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if that's a peaceful transition like 91 when the Soviet Union collapsed, or if it's catastrophic within the Russian space and it's a civil war. I don't know. We've already started to see those military personnel be arrested because they were dissenting. We saw people in the state governments in St. Petersburg pass resolutions to force Putin to stop the war, and then they were removed by the Kremlin. So it's there. There's an underlying angst, and all it takes, and we were talking about this, dictatorships are very stable until they're not, and then they're catastrophically unstable. And so what we're seeing is where that could go. And I think Ukraine has been supplied, and they'll continue to be supplied, and they're going to continue to be bolstered and motivated, especially when you get rocketed in Kyiv to fight to the very last man. And that means that one of two outcomes: Russia wins or Ukraine wins. And that's the only way we're probably going to see peace. Otherwise, it'll be a stagnant battlefield where it'll become trench warfare, what we saw in Crimea for the last 8 years, where we in the West didn't see what was going on, but there was still a war being fought. They had lines, and ceasefires would happen for a couple of days, and then they'd flare up again. Only this time it'd be much worse because it's with a better equipped army and in Ukraine, and also a more motivated and more embarrassed Putin. So unfortunately, it means a lot of people die. That's the sad story.
That's early when this kicked off. That was kind of my thought was a conflict like this doesn't end without a lot of death. And that doesn't necessarily always mean on the battlefield. It could mean countries blockaded, not getting the food they need.
Absolutely.
Revolution or whatever, upheaval at home. If for the Russian government to not exist in the form that it does today, realistically, the transition from the Soviet Union to what we have today with Russia and the Republic, that was very, in a very short window, a non-bloody event. And I know that extrapolated out, there were a lot of conflicts and a lot of civil wars. So it was bloody. It's not fair to call it necessarily a total peaceful transition, but those changes don't happen easily. So
no,
if we're looking forward out into 2023, I think it's pretty safe to assume now the war will go into 2023. I'm kind of torn on, I can see, I shouldn't say I'm kind of torn. I can see an argument for who benefits in both ways. In my mind, Russia could benefit from getting more of these conscripts, getting more of these recruits out to these units. The longer they have to do that, the more they'll be able to refill these units. And that gives time for the West and for NATO to lose interest, which personally, I'm surprised that more countries haven't lost interest already. We have such a short attention span. On the other side, Ukraine gives Ukraine time to retake more territory and to restock and rearm, reequip. What do you think? Where does the advantage lie in, say, the next 6 months if the war continues?
I absolutely think it still lies with Ukraine, because even if we lose interest in the West, we have front-loaded the ability to supply them for at least the near term, 3 to 6 months, with the packages that have passed. So even if it's not in the media, which Putin is doing a good job of keeping it in the media by rocketing civilian infrastructure. So he's doing himself a disservice by doing that. But, and I'm a big disciple of Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges. He was the UCOM commander while I was in Joint Multinational Readiness Center.
Nice.
And he and I both believe, not that we're talking or anything, but just reading his stuff, we both believe that the tide of this war is irreversibly in Ukraine's favor, unless Russia does something drastically stupid, such as massive nuclear strike. And I just don't think they will. And so over the next, probably by the end of this year, because of the massive gains we've seen, and just in the last month, the massive amounts of territory, I would say probably the majority of what Russia has gained since the beginning of this war will be back in Ukrainian hands, because they're flooding 10,000 people every 2 to 3 weeks. The Ukrainians are flooding more troops to the front line. They're getting more advanced equipment. They're getting more HIMARS. We're giving them more of those. They're still using Western intelligence, and the Russian military is being cut off in their logistics supply lines and their ground lines of communication, which is like how they resupply, how they reman, refit. Those are being cut off constantly. And I think over the next 3 to 6 months, definitively we'll see a return to the previous, the pre-February situation. Zelensky has said that he wants to retake Crimea. I'm not sure what that looks like. That would be difficult because that becomes a sea fight in the Black Sea. And although Ukraine sunk the Moskva and that was cool, Ukraine doesn't have a navy. And so the Russians can support Crimea with more of a multifaceted capability, ground, sea, and air, although their air assets are garbage right now. But what I'm seeing now is I think Ukraine will take back a lot of their territory by the end of this year, if not early next year, and then potentially pushed for Crimea in the summer of next year. They're not doing what Russia had hoped that they would do. The Ukrainians are not stopping for the winter. They have been supplied with Western equipment that works well in the winter. They're pushing the Russians into flat land up in the Luhansk region, up past Severodonetsk, which lends itself to frozen ground. And the Ukrainians have the upper hand for the winter. And they're not going to stop. Russia was hoping they would stop like this was World War II, where there's kind of a lull in the winter fighting. But the Ukrainians are like, nope, we're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep fighting. We're going to drive you out of here through the winter. And I do think that it's irreversible at this point, unless Russia does something drastic. And it would be a general mobilization, but his population would not be on board for that. That would probably be the stake in his heart right there.
We've had this question come in a few times, and I think we've hit on it like a bunch of little ways, but Chad, would you mind giving just a quick once over on your background and experience?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay. So I was in the US Army. I still am technically, although I'm IRR, I'm individual Red Reserve now, but I was active for 11 years, almost 11 years. I got out as a major. I was a logistics officer, company commander in 1st Infantry Division in a transportation company. After that, I went to Europe, where I was at the Joint Multinational Readiness Center. That's a training center where we train. The U.S. trains other countries, where we've trained anywhere between 5 to up to 30 nations in one scenario. I did a lot of. I was an observer coach trainer for that, and trained everyone from Ukraine to France to the United Kingdom, Germany, many countries. From there, I stayed in Germany, and I was a logistics planner for NATO exercises. And so I worked in the NATO space, and a lot of the planning came with projecting what would Russia do. And it's interesting because we never thought Russia would be this bad. We thought there was a lot more parity with the United States. So we planned for that. That's how we trained other countries. And I hope they still do. There's no reason to back off that type of training and be like, well, they suck, so we provide bad training. But that's what I did there. My education, I have an MBA from Maryland, and then I have a master's in public policy from Johns Hopkins. And my biggest expertise is in China. That's what my master's thesis was on Chinese-Taiwan relations and within the US and how their influences. But my experience in NATO trained me a lot, taught me a lot on Russia. So I've deployed to Iraq as a lieutenant and a captain. I ran gun trucks in Iraq. So that's kind of a once around the world of kind of my background, credentials, I guess you could call them. So.
And another one that, let me make sure I get the name right here, but it's around James Wiley. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing that probably. He asked, why do you think that Russia has not been designated a terrorist state? And I was going to punt that to you because I think that's more of a geopolitical question probably than anything.
I think you mean like a state sponsor of terrorism, I assume. So it's a good question. I wish they would. And Congress has been trying to do so. I think it really is where I just talked about Putin is trying to escalate to de-escalate. I think the US is trying to find any way possible to maintain a de-escalatory position while still supporting Ukraine. It's why we haven't given them Abrams or F-15s or things like that. I think the reality is nothing changes. It just becomes rhetoric. We've already sanctioned them the way we sanction state sponsors of terrorism. So naming them that, it just means, yeah, okay, now what? We don't give them supplies. We already don't do that. So I think it's just an unnecessary step that the Biden administration recognizes. We all know they're conducting terrorist acts. We know they're sponsoring terrorism, but to absolutely name it gives more angst and anger and gives an excuse for Putin to escalate and provides very little benefit for us on our side. All it does is, yeah, high five. We did a good thing. They're terrorists. Now what? We give the same equipment we're giving to Ukraine. And I think that's kind of the thought process is we want to maintain a stance of we're on the high ground. And I personally, if the Biden administration came out and said, we're naming them a state sponsor of terrorism, I'd be like, yes, absolutely. But if they don't, I understand why. It does create a political situation.
Is that similar to, I think it was in the 90s, the US wouldn't refer to Rwanda, I believe it was, as a genocide? Because if we called it a genocide, then we had to answer to why we weren't going in to stop it. So like if we call Russia a terrorist state, then immediately you're just going to let that happen.
Well, it's interesting. The US terrorism stance is very disjointed. I mean, we have many terrorist states that we just don't do anything in. I don't think it is similar to Rwanda, but the reality is there was no concern of Rwanda escalating to a point where they would do something that would hurt the global stage. Russia has the capability to do that, whether it's in the energy space, whether it's in the military space with nuclear weapons. If we were to name them a state sponsor of terror, whether we like it or not, we're still business allies with China and India. And when we do that, it embarrasses those allies and forces them to answer that question like, China, why are you supporting terrorism? And we all know that they're doing bad things with like the Uyghurs and things like that. But we don't want to provoke China into more of the Russian camp. We want them to see us as, hey, we're just trying to make sure that territorial integrity stays the same, which is something China preaches constantly. And we're trying to show the world that we're not escalating. We're responding. Escalating by saying they're a state-sponsored terrorism because they're committing terrorist acts is escalatory on our side. Now, I wish, and again, mentor General Ben Hodges wishes the same. I wish we would just call a spade and do what needs to be done, but I understand why we don't, like I said.
Hey, Greg Johnson, appreciate the support, man. That's awesome. There's one here that's not always a fun one to get into, and I'll tackle it first, Scott. You can weigh in or not, your call. Oh man, let me make sure I get the question was, do we view the United States carpet bombing in Iraq? There we go. Chuckle 2-1. I see you there, man. It says, does Scott consider the U.S. carpet bombing of Iraq in 2003 a terrorist act? So I'll tackle that first. I think that our actions in Iraq in 2003 harmed the U.S.'s credibility in a lot of ways. Our justification for going to war turned out to not be true. Iraq has been a mess for a long time, and the U.S. played a large part in that. So I think what happened in 2003, following from 2003 to, I don't know if I can put a pin and say when we started to turn things around there in a good way, if at all. But that's being thrown in the U.S.'s face right now with Ukraine. And there's some justification there. How can the U.S. go into Iraq and Russia can't go into Ukraine? And it sucks that even has to be a debate. They're different for sure. But we gave a lot of people some ammunition there because that wasn't the right move. In terms of carpet bombing, I'm not sure there was necessarily carpet bombing in Iraq, could be wrong. But yeah, the strikes against civilian infrastructure, that would have been incorrect. That would have been the wrong move. Chet?
So, and I agree. And I think the more visualization of the carpet bombing was more in 91. We didn't really carpet bomb a whole lot. it was all smart weaponry in 2003. And I'm not justifying it because I agree. I didn't like Iraq. I don't think we should have done it the way we did. I think it was a trigger pull, knee jerk reaction to beat our chest after 9/11. It was just another, we were doing Afghanistan, but who else can we take out with this? And I don't think we took out the right people. People on my feed have known for a long time I'm not a big fan of the Saudis. They were, I think, more involved in 9/11 than Iraq was. But it was, and so I disagree with our stance and what we did in Iraq. And I went there, I fought there, unfortunately. So, but my counter to that is when someone goes, it's pretty simple. When someone murders someone, they don't go, oh, well, there's been murder forever, so I'm going to continue murdering people because what about them? Yes, the US is not perfect. And I fully admit that. And going into Iraq and that whole debacle is something that I disagree with, and a lot of Americans disagree with, and a lot of the world community disagreed with. But that doesn't give an excuse. It's just like that's the same rhetoric Putin would say, well, we dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, so we can be justified in dropping nuclear weapons. Well, no, you can't, because we've grown since then, and we realize the devastation, and we realize what a terrible weapon it is. So yes, when they first came out, we used them to end the war in Japan, but that doesn't mean that gives free rein for the whole world, the 9 or so nuclear powers, to just use them as their chess piece to get what they want, to take the territory of others, to kill other people. We need to grow as a human global community. And if we allow people to rely on the past of what has happened as their justification for the future, we're never going to grow. And I'm one of the first to admit that our reasoning for going into Iraq and our reasoning for that fight was misguided. And I really wish we didn't go and fight that war, but we did. That doesn't mean Ukraine is open for invasion from Russia and that it's welcomed because of what the US did. Those are two separate events, and those events need to be addressed separately. Both the US with their continued efforts to rebuild Iraq, albeit still kind of unsuccessfully, and then Russia doing what they're doing, the war crimes they're committing, the legitimate, instead of hitting military targets, hitting playgrounds and civilian infrastructure on purpose. Those are two separate events, and I see them as separate. But he's right, yeah. The US is not without blood on its hands in its history. No country is. There's no country. We have to find the better route, and that's where we're at right now.
Artem has a good question that I think is relevant, timely right now. He said, did Russia finally start the war for real by striking critical infrastructure of Ukraine 2 days in a row? New guy in charge of the operation on Russian side. Thoughts? So I just want to add to that question, Artem, or maybe a couple thoughts on it. I think it's been interesting since day one of this war, there has been an argument that Russia is holding back. And it's a very hard argument it's confusing to me, to be honest, because in some ways they are. We haven't seen all of Russia's air power over Ukraine. We haven't seen the entire Russian army moving into Ukraine. So in some senses, they are holding back. I think when people use that term, it suggests that they're just itching to go, and they're not. I'm a little torn on it. If they can and aren't, or if they can't, so they aren't. But anyways, what do you think about that? Is it really starting the war right now?
I don't think it's starting the war right now for real. But I do agree that they are holding back, but I think they're holding back because they have to. I think what happened is they realized that their full on paper military strength is not translating to reality. So they're being forced to hold it back. Sure, you can say, I have 1.5 million troops ready to go. But are they really ready to go? We've seen that that's not the case. When it comes to things like their advanced fighter jets, which they have like 5 or so active, they're concerned with exploitation efforts by the US. We have those aircraft flying along the borders of Ukraine, Every missile that is fired, every aircraft that is flown, those aircraft are being detected and analyzed by Western technology. And Russia's not stupid in this regard. They don't want to send their like Su-57s, their most advanced fighters, because then we'll all go, holy crap, we can see those on radar easily. They don't want to expose that. And for two reasons. One, it shows that they're inept in their warfare. Two, a lot of other countries are wanting to purchase these things. And so we've seen this with their anti-aircraft missile systems like the S-400, and how their failure rate is way higher in real battlefield situations than what they initially said. And you're seeing countries from everywhere from India to Israel like come forward and go, hey, you told us one thing and we're seeing a different thing in reality. What's up with that? So Russia has to purposefully hold back what is objectively their best stuff because they don't want it exposed. And we've seen images of their supposed 5th-gen fighter, and experts are like, there's no way that that's a true stealth fighter from anything but the front. Detection from the bottom side, rear especially, there's no way. And they don't want to confirm that by using that stuff. So I think Russia is having to purposefully hold back. And they're holding back in a way that it doesn't matter if they have it, they're never going to be able to deploy it en masse. It's just going to be a trickle effect where conscripts will get a few rifles. We saw images of them getting Mosin-Nagants from World War II. They're not even using AK-47s, let alone the AK-74s or even the newer versions they have. They're getting World War II bolt-action rifles to their conscripts. And that signals to me that they may have that many people, but they can't deploy that many people. So when people say they're holding back, sure, you're holding back like you're trying to hold back thousands of unarmed people running into a hail of bullets and dying because they just don't have the ability to supply, and they're scared of it, the exploitation that would come from the West, which would actually absolutely happen.
Larry Barrett, appreciate the support, man. There, that's awesome. One more thing I wanted to hit on here, and no pressure because it's a very specific thing and it's very recent. But the new Russian commander, it appears they've added a commander for the overall operation in Ukraine. My 2 cents is the unity of command piece has been very interesting. There's been so many different commanders in charge of different groupings so far in this war that it seems like it makes sense. It has made sense for a long time to have one commander in charge of the entire Ukraine operation. I imagine that'll change some things, but I don't think that's a magic pill to resolve a lot. I mean, you're talking about major issues in a lot of different areas of the Russian military. One new commander is not going to change that overnight. But anyways, Chad, what do you got there?
It's interesting because whether it's been over like a supreme allied commander over the entire operation for Russia or just the most senior commander, they've had 9 of those since the war started. 9 different people in charge or saying they're in charge. Whether they were actually in charge of the overall operations is debatable. But now the last like 2 or 3 supposedly were overarching, seeing everything. But one thing that signals to me is telling is where he came from. And he was the head of the aerospace, what would be like their Air Force division, which is signaling to me where this fight is going. And it's going to take, well, it's both good and bad. It's good for the Ukrainian ground forces because he is not a ground commander. So the Ukrainian ground forces are going to continue to be successful. What's bad is he's a missile commander. And that means we're going to see a lot more missile attacks into not necessarily the front line, but likely into infrastructure.
Targeting power plants, targeting
rail lines, targeting cities and playgrounds. And a lot of that I chalk up to their out of smart munitions, but some of that is trying to inflict terror into the civilian population, into capitulation. So putting their Air Force guy in charge is changing, it's inevitably going to change where the focus is. I mean, an Air Force commander is going to know Air Force stuff, and he's going to want to do Air Force things. And so they're going to focus on, they don't have the ability to create air superiority still. The Russians, nor the Ukrainians, frankly. But because it's an air guy, I feel like this is going to be a heavier round of missiles, which Russia has a lot of rockets and missiles still over. Still, that's actually probably still their most capable avenue for inflicting death and destruction on Ukraine. And that's where we'll see it go from there. It's going to be, unfortunately, a lot of, like I said, a lot of people will die, a lot of civilians will die. And it's trying to create enough fear that Europe and Ukraine, and within Ukraine, it's fracturing factions until finally someone capitulates and says, that's enough death. Maybe peace is the best way, in allowing Russia to take that section of Ukraine they've already taken. That's what Putin's hoping. And I think that's where it's going. And this guy operated in Syria. He was big missiles guy in Syria too. He did a lot of really terrible attacks into civilian population centers like Aleppo and stuff like that. So that's what I think will look like.
All right, we'll keep an eye on it. I think we're going to wrap up for now, but Chad, thank you so much for taking the time. Everybody interested, his link to his YouTube channel and TikTok are all in the description below. Yeah, we'll do this again soon, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, anytime. Let me know. Like I said, thanks everyone. Thanks